The world is a study in indigo and slate, a canvas of deep, textured shadows where the sky ends and the mountains begin. It is a landscape rendered in the soft, grainy strokes of a dark pencil, the edges of the horizon smudged into a blur of perpetual twilight. Here, the air does not move so much as it leans, a heavy, invisible weight pressing against the lungs, smelling of ancient ice and the metallic tang of frozen iron. It is a cold that does not sting. Rather, it numbs, a slow and methodical erasure of sensation that begins at the tips of the fingers and moves inward toward the heart, rhythmic and inevitable. Every breath is a visible ghost, a plume of pale gray vapor that hangs in the stillness for a second too long before dissolving into the gloom. The silence is absolute, broken only by the low, subterranean groan of the shifting permafrost and the distant, hollow whistle of a wind that has traveled 1,000 miles over empty tundra just to brush against the side of a rusted boiler. The lantern sits upon a crate of iron spikes, its flame a small, fragile teardrop of amber trapped behind soot-streaked glass. The light it casts is weak, reaching out only a few feet before being swallowed by the vast, oppressive blue of the mountain night. In this flickering circle of warmth, the textures of the world become visible. The rough, splintered grain of the wooden sleepers, the crystalline frost clinging to the heads of the bolts, and the thick, matted wool of a heavy coat, colored in shades of charcoal and ash. The light does not dance. It trembles, casting long, distended shadows that stretch across the snow like the fingers of a reaching hand. These shadows are not black, but a bruised, deep violet, layered with the hatch marks of a steady, patient hand drawing upon a dark surface. There is no vibrance here, only the slow, steady pulse of a world gone dormant, a world where time has slowed to the pace of a glacier grinding stone into dust over the course of centuries. The rail layer moves with a deliberate, agonizing slowness, his boots crunching into the crust of the snow with a sound like breaking glass. Each step is a calculated effort, a negotiation with gravity and the frozen earth. There is no urgency in his movements, for urgency is a luxury of the warm and the living. Here, there is only the duty, a heavy, leaden thing that sits upon the shoulders like a yoke. The iron rails lie in the snow, long and dark and indifferent, waiting to be claimed. They are cold to the touch, a cold so profound that it feels like heat, a searing, dry sensation that pulls the moisture from the skin. To handle the steel is to commune with the very bones of the earth, a substance forged in fire but now surrendered to the ice. The metal is slick with a thin glaze of frost, reflecting the dim lantern light in a dull, oily sheen. It does not glint. It merely exists, a horizontal line of absolute permanence against the shifting, chaotic drifts of the white waste. The sound of the wind is a low, monochromatic hum, a single note held for an eternity. It vibrates through the iron, a faint, metallic singing that can be felt in the palms of the hands even through the thick, grease-stained leather of the work gloves. The gloves themselves are stiff, frozen into the shape of a grip, the leather cracked and worn thin at the thumbs. They tell a story of repetitive labor, of thousands of spikes driven into thousands of sleepers, a lineage of toil that stretches back into the fog of memory. There is no thought of the destination, no vision of the locomotives that will one day thunder over these tracks, breathing fire and steam into the frigid air. There is only the immediate reality of the next foot of ground, the next alignment, the next heavy heave of the iron. The mind retreats into a quiet, dark space, a small room within the skull where the only sounds are the heartbeat and the rhythmic, rasping pull of air through a frost-covered scarf. Above, the stars are tiny, sharp pinpricks of light, cold and distant and utterly uncaring. They provide no illumination, only a sense of the staggering scale of the emptiness. The sky is a deep, velvety black, textured with the faint, swirling dust of distant nebulae that look like soft chalk rubbings on a dark board. There is a sense of being at the very edge of the map, in a place where the laws of the world have thinned out, leaving only the raw elements of stone, ice, and metal. The mountains are hulking shapes of indigo, their peaks lost in the low-hanging clouds that promise more snow, a soft, silent burial for the day's work. The snow does not fall so much as it descends, a slow-motion collapse of the atmosphere, each flake a tiny, intricate geometric ghost settling onto the dark wool of the sleeve. The work is a series of small, heavy sensations. The weight of the sledgehammer, its handle smoothed by the friction of 1,000 palms, feels like an extension of the arm. It is cold, the wood holding the chill of the night deep within its fibers. When it strikes the iron, the sound is not a ring, but a dull, percussive thud that is immediately swallowed by the snow. The vibration travels up the arms, a jarring reminder of the resistance of the earth. The earth does not want the railway. It resists with a passive, geological stubbornness, pushing back with the weight of the frost and the density of the stone. But the duty remains. The duty is the only thing that is warm, a small, glowing coal of purpose kept alive in the center of the chest. It is a quiet, unspeaking thing, devoid of pride or ambition. It is simply the necessity of the next movement, the next breath, the next inch of progress against the infinite. The lantern flickers again, the oil burning low, the scent of the wick heavy and cloying in the thin air. It creates a small sanctuary of visibility, a tiny theater where the drama of the iron and the wood plays out in slow motion. The colors are muted, a palette of desaturation where even the orange of the flame feels tired. The shadows on the snow are long and rhythmic, mirroring the spacing of the sleepers. Each sleeper is a block of treated timber, smelling of creosote and old forests, heavy and damp with the cold. They are laid down with a groan of wood against ice, a sound that feels like a complaint from the past. The snow quickly begins to fill the gaps between them, a white shroud seeking to reclaim the ground, to hide the intrusion of the man-made line. It is a constant battle of displacement, a slow-motion wrestling match between the will of the layer and the patience of the winter. The cold has a texture, a graininess like the paper the story is drawn upon. It feels rough against the exposed skin of the cheeks, a constant, abrasive presence. The eyelashes are heavy with rime, blurring the vision into a soft, impressionistic haze. Every blink is a slow, sticky movement. The world is reduced to the circle of light and the weight of the iron. The history of this place is a history of silence, of years where nothing moved but the wind and the shadows. The introduction of the railway is a thin, fragile thread of human intent stitched into the vast, indifferent fabric of the wild. It is a boring history, a history of inches and ounces, of the caloric cost of a single swing of the hammer. There are no great battles here, only the quiet, ongoing skirmish between the warmth of a man's blood and the absolute zero of the mountain peaks. The layer pauses, his hands resting on the cold steel of the rail. He does not look up. He does not look back at the miles of track already laid, nor does he look forward into the darkness where the line must go. He looks only at the point where the iron meets the snow. The lantern light catches the edge of the rail, creating a thin, shimmering line of silver that seems to float in the indigo void. It is a beautiful, lonely sight, a single stroke of a pencil across a dark page. The wind picks up, a low moan that carries the sound of grinding ice from the glaciers high above. It is a sound that has no beginning and no end, a circular, haunting melody that lulls the senses into a state of heavy, dreamless exhaustion. The body feels distant, a heavy machine that operates on its own, driven by the rhythmic requirements of the task. The snow underfoot has been packed into a hard, slick floor, polished by the passage of boots and the dragging of heavy loads. It reflects the sky, a pale, ghostly blue that seems to glow with its own internal light. There is a sense of permanence in the cold, a feeling that this moment has always existed and will always exist, a loop of indigo and iron, of breath and shadow. The heavy, soft-edged drawings of this world are fixed, the colored pencil marks layered so thickly that they have a physical depth. You can almost feel the waxiness of the pastel, the way it clings to the dark paper, the way the light is built up from the shadows rather than the shadows being cast by the light. Everything is born from the dark here. The rails, the sleepers, the man, the lantern. They are all temporary interruptions in an eternal blue-gray night. As the hour grows deeper, the cold settles into the marrow of the bones. It is a quiet ache, a heavy, dull resonance that matches the beat of the heart. The duty does not falter. The hands move, the iron settles, the spikes are driven. It is a sequence of events that requires no thought, only the steady, mechanical application of force. The world remains still, a frozen tableau of endurance. The lantern's glow is a small, defiant act of presence in the face of the vast, unblinking eye of the winter. Each flake of snow that lands on the hot glass of the lantern hisses and vanishes, a tiny, momentary protest against the dark. The man continues, a shadow among shadows, a builder of lines in a world of circles, moving with the heavy, hypnotic rhythm of a dream that never quite ends. The second rail is heavier than the first, or perhaps it only seems so because the cold has begun to settle more deeply into the joints of the knees and the small of the back. It is a length of iron forged in a distant, soot-stained valley, where the sun barely touches the floor of the foundry for more than 3 hours a day. The steel carries that heritage of gloom within its molecular structure, a dense and uncompromising weight that demands everything from the person who handles it. It lies half buried in a drift of fine, powdery snow that has the texture of crushed bone. As the rail is lifted, the snow falls away in a slow, silent curtain, revealing the dark, matte surface of the metal. It is not smooth. It is pitted with microscopic imperfections, a terrain of iron that mirrors the rugged mountains surrounding it. In the dim, amber wash of the lantern light, these pits cast tiny, elongated shadows, making the rail look like an ancient, fossilized spine being exhumed from a prehistoric grave. The indigo shades of the night cling to the underside of the steel, a deep, waxy blue that suggests the color of a bruise on a dark surface. There is a specific, tactile quality to the scene, as if a heavy hand has layered charcoal and soft pastel over a rough, toothy paper, creating a world where the darkness has a physical, gritty presence. The sleepers are waiting, arranged in a line that disappears into the smudged horizon. They are thick blocks of oak and pine, saturated with creosote until they are the color of old coffee and dried blood. The scent of the preservative is sharp and medicinal, cutting through the clean, sterile smell of the frozen air. It is a heavy, oily aroma that lingers in the back of the throat, a reminder of industrial processes and the violent felling of forests. Each sleeper is a ghost of a tree that once stood in a warmer place, now condemned to lie forever in the permafrost, supporting the weight of the iron and the passing of time. The wood is cold, but it lacks the searing, predatory cold of the steel. It is a dull, absorbent chill that seems to drink the heat from the palms. As the rail is lowered onto the wood, the sound is a heavy, rhythmic thud, a low-frequency vibration that travels through the soles of the boots and into the bones of the legs. It is a sound of finality, of something being set in its proper place after an eternity of waiting. The snow around the sleeper is displaced, pushed aside in soft, white waves that catch the faint, warm glow of the lantern, turning the edges of the drifts into a pale, flickering gold. The process of alignment is a slow and meditative ritual. It requires a level of precision that feels absurd in the face of such overwhelming natural chaos. A small iron bar is used to nudge the rail, a fraction of an inch at a time, until the line is true. The metal-on-metal sound is a high, thin screech that is immediately dampened by the vastness of the mountains, reduced to a mere whisper by the time it reaches the nearest peak. The layer watches the gap, his eyes narrowed against the biting air, his vision swimming slightly in the graininess of the low light. The shadows of his own fingers, enlarged by the lantern, dance across the rail like the legs of a giant spider. There is no joy in the precision, only a quiet, stoic satisfaction in the order being imposed upon the wilderness. The world is a chaos of shifting snow and howling wind, but the railway is a line of absolute logic, a horizontal constant in a vertical world. Each inch of progress is a victory of geometry over geology, a slow-motion stitching of the landscape with threads of iron and wood. The sledgehammer rests against the side of the crate, its iron head coated in a delicate frosting of rime. It is a tool of immense, blunt power, balanced at the end of a long, tapered handle of hickory. The wood is darkened by sweat and oil, the grain polished to a glass-like finish by the friction of labor. When the hammer is lifted, the weight of it feels familiar and oppressive, a burden that the muscles have long since accepted. The act of driving a spike is a sequence of movements that has been repeated so many times it no longer requires the intervention of the conscious mind. The spike is placed against the iron flange, its pointed tip biting into the surface of the timber. The first blow is a tap, a gentle setting of the metal into the wood. The second blow is a full, heavy swing, a controlled descent of the hammer head that meets the spike with a solid, resonant crack. The sound echoes briefly, a lonely punctuation mark in the silence of the tundra. The third blow drives the spike home, the head of the nail pinning the rail to the sleeper with a permanent, unyielding grip. The vibration of the strike is a physical sensation, a jolt that travels through the arms and settles in the chest, a reminder of the raw force required to build a world in the ice. The lantern's flame is a small, flickering pulse of life in a world of static blue. It consumes the oil with a slow, steady hiss, the sound barely audible above the low moan of the wind. The glass is streaked with soot, creating patterns of dark and light that resemble the bark of an old tree. Within the circle of its influence, the colors are warm and tactile, the burnt umber of the wood, the raw sienna of the rusted bolts, the pale ochre of the lantern's glow. Beyond the light, the world falls away into a deep, impenetrable indigo, a color so saturated it feels heavy. The mountains are hulking, charcoal shapes that loom in the periphery, their features smudged by the falling snow. It is as if the artist has used a wide, flat brush to lay down a wash of Payne's gray, leaving only the smallest area for the details of the work. The snow continues to fall, not in flakes, but in a fine crystalline dust that settles into every crease of the clothing and every crack in the wood. It is a slow burial, a white silence that seeks to fill the spaces between the thoughts and the movements. The body is a machine that is slowly losing its heat. Under the layers of heavy wool and leather, the skin is clammy, the heart beating with a slow, rhythmic thud that matches the pace of the work. The breath comes in long, measured pulls, the air so cold it feels like swallowing needles. Each exhale creates a thick cloud of vapor that momentarily obscures the lantern, a gray veil that dissolves into the indigo night. The fingers are stiff, the joints clicking with the cold, the skin of the knuckles cracked and red. There is a dull ache in the shoulders, a constant heavy pressure that has become a part of the self. The mind does not wander, it stays focused on the immediate, the boring, the repetitive. One spike, two spikes, three spikes. Move the lantern, move the crate, lift the next rail. It is a cycle of existence that has no room for the past or the future, only the infinite present of the steel and the snow. The history being made here is a history of endurance, a story written in the sweat of the brow and the frost of the breath, a narrative that moves at the speed of the iron as it inches across the frozen earth. The wind has a voice, but it does not speak in words. It speaks in a language of friction, the sound of air moving over the sharp edges of the mountain ridges and through the skeletal branches of the distant, frozen larch trees. It is a sound of erosion, of the world being slowly worn down by the elements. It carries with it the smell of the high glaciers, a scent that is metallic and old, like the smell of a cellar that has not been opened in 100 years. The wind pushes against the layer, a steady, invisible hand that tries to turn him away from his task. It catches the edges of his coat, the heavy fabric flapping with a dull, rhythmic sound like the wings of a large, tired bird. The snow is kicked up from the ground, swirling in low, ghostly eddies that dance around the base of the sleepers before vanishing into the dark. These drifts are like the white highlights in a drawing, sharp and bright against the deep blue of the surface, applied with a quick, decisive stroke of a pale pastel. The iron railway layer is a figure of quiet, unceasing motion in a landscape of absolute stillness. He is a part of the drawing, his form rendered in the same dark, muted tones as the mountains and the sky. His coat is a study in textures, the rough, itchy wool, the smooth, cold buttons, the stiff, frozen seams. His face is hidden behind the folds of a heavy scarf, only his eyes visible, reflecting the amber light of the lantern. There is a sense of deep, internal solitude in his posture, a man who has become a part of the iron he lays. He does not complain to the wind. He does not curse the cold. He simply exists within it, a vessel for the duty that drives him forward. The railway is his legacy, a line of steel that will remain long after he has been forgotten, a permanent scar on the face of the winter. The history of the world is often told in terms of kings and wars, but here, it is told in the spacing of the sleepers and the depth of the spikes. The night is an ocean of indigo, and the lantern is a single drifting spark. Time has lost its linear quality, becoming a circular, repetitive loop of sensation. The cold is the only constant, a heavy, atmospheric presence that defines the boundaries of the world. It is a boring history, a slow and methodical recording of the passage of minutes and the accumulation of inches. The steel is the pen, the snow is the page, and the man is the hand that writes. Each stroke is heavy and deliberate, a testament to the weight of existence in a place where the sun is only a memory. The drawings are never finished. They are only added to, layer upon layer of dark pigment and soft light, building a world that is as beautiful as it is desolate, as hypnotic as it is exhausting. The rail settles into the snow with a final, quiet sigh, the iron meeting the wood in a perfect, cold embrace. The layer pauses, his hand resting on the head of the last spike. He feels the cold of the iron through his glove, a deep and familiar chill. He looks out into the darkness where the next sleeper waits in the shadows, a dark rectangle against the pale blue of the snow. The mountain is a silent witness, its peaks lost in the indigo clouds, its presence a heavy geological weight on the horizon. There is no end to the work, only the next rail, the next spike, the next breath. The lantern flickers, its light dimming for a moment before flaring back to life, casting a long, trembling shadow across the newly laid track. The shadow looks like a line drawn with a soft, dark pencil, a mark of human intent in a world of ice. The wind moans again, a low, monochromatic sound that lulls the senses into a deeper state of numbness, a state where the only thing that matters is the weight of the iron and the stillness of the snow. The vibration of the final hammer strike lingers in the air for a heartbeat, a low hum that seems to travel through the metal of the rail and deep into the mountain itself, before it is eventually smothered by the absolute weight of the silence. It is a silence that has a physical density, like a heavy woolen blanket laid over the world, dampening every thought and every sound. The layer stands straight for a moment, a slow, creaking movement of the spine that feels like the straightening of a rusted hinge. His breath is a steady, rhythmic pulse, a series of pale, ghostly clouds that drift upward into the indigo void, illuminated briefly by the dying warmth of the lantern before they vanish into the gray grain of the sky. The stillness is so profound that he can hear the faint, crystalline tinkling of the frost forming on his own eyelashes, a microscopic sound of the atmosphere turning into ice. The landscape remains a study in shadows, a dark, textured page where the only reality is the immediate proximity of the work. He turns back toward the supply sled, a low-slung wooden platform that sits like a dark, heavy shadow against the pale, blue-tinted crust of the snow. The sled is laden with the raw materials of progress, crates of heavy iron spikes, stacks of fish plates, and the long, dark bars used to leverage the rails into their final alignment. The wood of the sled is aged and weathered, its surface etched with the deep, erratic lines of years spent in the service of the line. In the visual language of this world, the sled would be rendered with thick, charcoal hatch marks, its edges softened by a light dusting of white pastel that represents the persistent, creeping frost. The lantern hangs from a small iron hook on the leading edge of the sled, its flame casting a narrow, flickering pool of amber across the frozen ground. As he moves toward it, the light shifts, the shadows of the crates lengthening and shortening in a slow, hypnotic dance across the snow. The act of moving the sled is a heavy, communal effort between the man and the mountain. He grips the thick hemp rope, its fibers stiff and abrasive with frozen moisture. The rope is the color of dried straw, a pale, muted ochre that stands out against the deep indigo of the night. He leans into the harness, his boots searching for purchase on the slick, unyielding surface of the permafrost. There is a moment of resistance, a silent negotiation with friction, before the runners of the sled give way with a low, grinding groan. The sound is visceral, a deep-throated complaint of wood against ice that vibrates through the soles of his feet. The sled moves only a few feet, a distance measured in inches and ounces of effort, until the next section of the track is within reach. It is a slow, agonizingly boring progression, a sequence of movement that has been repeated until it has become a form of meditation. The crate of spikes is a heavy, iron-bound box, its contents cold and unyielding. As he reaches inside, the sound of the metal sliding against metal is a dull, rhythmic clatter, like the sound of large, flat stones being shifted in a riverbed. The spikes are long and dark, their heads square and functional, their points sharp enough to bite into the frozen grain of the oak sleepers. They feel like ice in his hand, a cold that bypasses the leather of the glove and settles directly into the nerves. He selects a handful of them, their weight a comforting, familiar presence in his palm. The lantern light catches the edges of the iron, creating a series of sharp, silver highlights that look like quick, decisive strokes of a white pencil on a dark, charcoal gray surface. There is no shine to the metal, only a dull, oily reflection that suggests the density of the material. The next sleeper must be cleared of its shroud of snow before the rails can be laid. He takes up a heavy, short-handled shovel, its blade worn thin and sharp by the constant abrasion of the earth. The shovel is a tool of pure utility, its wooden handle darkened by the oils of 1,000 hands. The movement of clearing the snow is a slow, rhythmic sweeping motion, the blade slicing through the frozen crust with a sound like a heavy saw cutting through dry timber. The snow is tossed aside in soft, powdery arcs that catch the lantern light for a fraction of a second, glowing with a faint, ghostly luminescence before disappearing into the shadows. The surface of the sleeper is revealed, a dark, rectangular slab of wood, its grain visible through a thin film of ice. The wood is a deep, saturated brown, almost black in the low light, the texture of the creosote finish appearing rough and grainy, like a layer of thick pastel applied with a heavy hand. The alignment of the next sleeper requires a level of patience that borderlines on the geological. He kneels in the snow, the cold of the ground seeping through the heavy fabric of his trousers, a slow and steady invasion of the senses. He uses a small iron bar to nudge the sleeper into its proper position, checking the distance with a length of notched wood. The movements are small, precise, and infinitely slow. There is no conversation, no sound but the wind and the occasional clink of the iron against the wood. The shadows cast by the lantern are long and distorted, stretching across the landscape like the skeletal fingers of the mountain itself. The light is a warm, flickering pulse that barely manages to keep the indigo darkness at bay. It is a chiaroscuro of the frozen waste, a world defined by the contrast between the small, fragile warmth of human intent and the vast, unblinking cold of the natural world. The air seems to grow thicker as the night progresses, the oxygen thin and metallic. Every breath is a labor, a conscious effort to draw the freezing atmosphere into the lungs. The cold has moved beyond the skin and the muscles, settling into the very marrow of the bones with a heavy, dull ache. It is a sensation that is constant and unchanging, a part of the environment like the snow or the iron. The layer does not fight the cold. He inhabits it, moving with a slowness that mirrors the freezing of water into ice. His movements are efficient and devoid of wasted energy, a mechanical survival that is both impressive and profoundly boring to witness. He is a figure of endurance, a dark silhouette against a darker background, his existence defined by the rhythm of the spikes and the weight of the rails. The sky remains a deep, velvety indigo, the clouds hanging low and heavy over the peaks. There is no moon to guide the work, only the stars that look like distant, uncaring sparks of flint. They provide a sense of scale that is almost unbearable, the realization that the tiny line of iron being laid is an infinitesimal scratch on the surface of an infinite world. The history being recorded here is not one of empires, but of the individual grain of the wood and the specific weight of the iron. It is a history of the physical world, told in the language of friction and gravity. The drawing of this scene would be a study in patience, the artist layering shade upon shade of blue and gray until the darkness has a tangible weight, the paper saturated with the pigment of the night. The layer takes up the sledgehammer once more. The handle is cold, the wood feeling like stone in his grip. He stands over the first spike of the new section, his feet planted firmly in the packed snow. The light from the lantern catches the side of his face, illuminating the thick rime of frost on his scarf and the deep, tired lines around his eyes. He looks like a statue carved from the mountains themselves, a monument to the silent endurance of the human spirit in the face of the absolute. He lifts the hammer, the weight of the iron head pulling at his shoulders, and begins the slow, rhythmic descent toward the spike. The sound of the first strike is a dull, percussive thud that marks the beginning of another cycle, another inch of progress in a world of miles, another word in the long, boring history of the iron and the snow. The hammer falls with a heavy, predictable cadence. 1, 2, 3. Each strike is a repetition of the last, a loop of sound and motion that lulls the mind into a state of hypnotic suspension. The world shrinks down to the point of contact between the hammer and the spike, a tiny theater of force and resistance. The vibration travels through the iron, through the wood, and into the ground, a heartbeat for the railway. The snow continues to fall, a slow and silent accumulation that threatens to erase the work as soon as it is completed. But the work continues, a steady and unyielding counterpoint to the entropy of the winter. The iron is laid, the spikes are driven, and the line moves forward, one heavy, rhythmic step at a time, into the deep and beautiful darkness of the mountain night. The junction where two rails meet is a place of profound, minute significance, a small gap of perhaps half an inch that allows the iron to breathe, to expand and contract with the shifting whims of the temperature. In this frozen kingdom, the metal is at its most brittle, its most contracted, huddled into itself against the absolute zero of the mountain night. The layer kneels before this gap, his shadow cast long and distorted across the newly laid sleepers, a dark, flickering shape that mimics the slow, heavy movements of his body. The world remains a canvas of deep indigo and charcoal, the textures of the drawing rendered in the thick, waxy strokes of a colored pencil on a black surface. The lantern is placed carefully upon the snow, its light creating a small, circular stage of amber and burnt orange. Within this circle, every detail is magnified. The individual grains of the wood, the microscopic crystals of frost on the rail, and the rough, frayed edges of the layer's heavy wool sleeves. From a thick canvas bag slung over the side of the sled, he retrieves the fish plates, two heavy, rectangular slabs of iron designed to bridge the joint between the rails. They are cold, a cold that seems to radiate from their core, a dense and ancient chill that has never known the sun. They are coated in a thin, translucent layer of protective grease that has frozen into a waxy, yellowed substance, resembling the thick application of a pale pastel. As he lifts them, the sound of the iron plates sliding against each other is a low, grinding clatter, a sound that feels heavy and tired. He presses the first plate against the side of the rail, the metal meeting metal with a dull, clinical thud. The alignment must be perfect. The holes in the fish plate must match the holes drilled into the web of the rail with mathematical certainty. In the dim light, the holes look like dark, empty eyes, staring out from the indigo depths of the steel. His fingers, encased in the stiff, grease-darkened leather of his work gloves, move with a slow and calculated clumsiness. Numbness has long since become a constant companion, a secondary layer of skin that separates him from the world. He reaches into a small tin for the bolts. These are thick, heavy cylinders of steel, their threads sharp and clean beneath the layer of frost. The sound they make as they rattle in the tin is light and percussive, a rhythmic clicking that is the only melody in the vast silence of the tundra. He picks one up, the weight of it centered in his palm. It is a solid, honest thing, a small piece of order in the chaotic white waste. He begins the process of threading the bolt through the fish plate and the rail, a task that requires a degree of focus that borders on the hypnotic. The bolt slides in with a faint, metallic hiss, the cold of the iron drawing the heat from his hands even through the thick leather. The nut is a heavy, hexagonal block of iron, its edges smoothed by the manufacturing process but roughened by the ambient frost. He begins to thread it onto the bolt, his movements repetitive and circular. The sound of the threads engaging is a minute rhythmic scratching, a sound that feels like a pencil being dragged across a rough sheet of paper. It is a boring, infinitesimal progress. Each turn of the nut is a fraction of an inch, a tiny victory against the entropy of the winter. He does not hurry. To hurry is to risk a cross thread, a mistake that would require him to back the nut off and start again, a delay that the body cannot afford in this temperature. He works with a steady, mechanical patience, his breath coming in slow, even plumes of gray vapor that drift across the lantern light like ghosts of forgotten thoughts. The wrench is a long, heavy lever of forged steel, its handle polished to a dull sheen by the friction of labor. It is cold to the touch, the metal holding the memory of the mountain's chill. He fits the head of the wrench over the nut, the iron teeth biting into the hexagonal edges with a solid, satisfying click. The act of tightening the bolt is a slow-motion exertion of force. He leans his weight into the wrench, his boots bracing against the packed snow, his muscles straining against the resistance of the iron. The movement is rhythmic and heavy, a long, slow pull, a pause to reset the wrench, and then another pull. Each movement is accompanied by the low, mournful groan of the wind as it travels over the ridges, a sound that provides a monochromatic soundtrack to the labor. The history of the railway is being written in these turns, in the tension of the bolts and the rigidity of the joints. The visuals of the scene are a study in chiaroscuro, the play of light and shadow defining the reality of the work. The lantern's amber glow catches the curve of the wrench, creating a shimmering highlight that looks like a stroke of white chalk on a dark board. The shadows are deep and layered, built up from shades of violet, indigo, and slate gray. There are no sharp lines here, only the soft, smudged edges of a pastel drawing where the forms emerge from the darkness rather than being defined by it. The snow around the junction has been trampled into a rough, textured surface, its peaks catching the light and its hollows filled with the deep blue of the night. It is a world of incredible depth and stillness, a place where the passage of time is measured by the incremental tightening of a single piece of steel. As the first bolt reaches its limit, he feels the resistance change, the iron becoming a single, solid unit. He gives the wrench one final, heavy tug, a definitive act of closure. The joint is now secure, the two rails bound together in a cold, unyielding embrace. He moves to the second bolt, and then the third, and then the fourth. The process is a loop of sensation and motion, a sequence that requires no thought but total presence. The mind retreats into a quiet, dark corner, observing the movements of the hands as if they belong to someone else. There is a sense of peace in the repetition, a meditative quality to the boredom of the task. The cold is a heavy, atmospheric pressure that holds everything in place, a preservative that keeps the world from moving too fast. Above, the sky has changed slightly, the clouds thinning in patches to reveal the deep, velvety blackness of the space beyond. The stars are tiny, distant sparks, their light filtered through the crystalline dust of the atmosphere. They provide a sense of staggering isolation, the realization that this small circle of light and this single man are the only things moving for hundreds of miles. The mountains loom in the distance, their indigo peaks silhouetted against the slightly lighter gray of the horizon. They are ancient, indifferent witnesses to the work, their presence a heavy, geological weight that humbles the efforts of the iron. The railway is a thin, fragile line, a human thought expressed in steel, stretching across a world that does not know its name. The wind shifts, bringing with it a fine, dry snow that has the consistency of sand. It rattles against the iron of the rails and the wood of the sleepers with a soft, persistent sound. It settles into the threads of the bolts and the creases of the layer's coat, a white dust that seeks to reclaim the ground. He brushes the snow from the fish plate with a gloved hand, a slow and rhythmic gesture that looks like the artist smudging a line to create a sense of movement. The movement of the hand is soft and deliberate, a quiet interaction with the elements. The history of this place is a history of such small gestures, of the accumulation of minor acts of endurance that eventually form the foundation of a civilization. It is a boring history, devoid of drama but filled with the weight of existence. The fourth nut is tightened and the junction is complete. He stands up slowly, the joints of his knees cracking with a sound like a dry twig snapping in the cold. He stretches his back, the heavy wool of his coat shifting with a muffled, textural sound. He looks down at the finished joint, the iron plates and the heavy bolts reflecting the lantern light in a dull, oily sheen. It is a beautiful, functional thing, a small piece of perfection in the middle of the wilderness. The line of the railway now extends another 30 feet into the darkness, a straight and true path that cuts through the indigo night. He takes a moment to simply breathe, the cold air filling his lungs and grounding him in the reality of the mountain. The silence returns, heavier than before, a deep and resonant stillness that lulls the senses into a state of profound calm. He reaches down and picks up the lantern, the handle cold and familiar in his grip. As he lifts it, the circle of light moves with him, revealing the next section of the path. The shadows dance and shift, the long, dark lines of the sleepers appearing and disappearing in the amber wash. He begins to move toward the next sleeper, his boots crunching in the snow with a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence. The world remains a dark, textured drawing, a place of indigo shadows and warm, flickering light. The history of the iron continues, one bolt at a time, one breath at a time, a slow and steady progression into the heart of the winter. There is no end in sight, only the next task, the next repetition, the next heavy heave of the iron against the snow. The small, portable brazier is a humble vessel of iron and fire, a blackened bucket with hand-punched holes that allow the oxygen to feed the glowing embers within. It sits nestled in a hollow of packed snow, its heat, a small, desperate protest against the encroaching frost that has claimed the rest of the mountain. In the visual language of this story, the brazier is a focal point of intense, warm pigment, a vibrant, saturated orange and a deep, flickering vermilion that cuts through the prevailing indigo of the dark paper. The artist has used the side of a soft pastel to create a glowing aura around the iron, a soft-edged halo that suggests the warmth without showing the flames directly. The smoke that rises from the coals is thick and sluggish, a coil of charcoal-gray vapor that twists into the air like a snake made of soot. It carries the scent of burning larch and old, sun-dried peat, a heavy and nostalgic aroma that feels out of place in this sterile, frozen world. The layer moves toward the brazier, his movements heavy and stiff, his boots dragging through the powdery drifts with a sound like a low-frequency hum. The purpose of the fire is not for the comfort of the man, but for the utility of the iron. The spikes, left in their open crates on the supply sled, have become so cold that they risk shattering the very timber they are meant to secure. He takes a long-handled iron tong, the metal of the tool cold and unyielding in his grip, and begins to transfer a few spikes at a time into the periphery of the glowing coals. The sound of the spikes sliding against the bottom of the brazier is a dull, metallic rattle, a sound that is muffled by the thick, atmospheric silence of the night. He watches as the iron begins to absorb the heat, the deep, matte black of the steel slowly transitioning into a faint, barely perceptible crimson. This change in color is subtle, rendered in the drawing with the lightest touch of a red pencil over the dark gray, a detail that only becomes visible if one looks closely at the grain of the surface. While the spikes warm, he turns his attention to the sleeper that lies directly ahead. The permafrost here has been particularly aggressive, a layer of ice as hard as granite having formed over the surface of the wood. To drive a spike into this would be an exercise in futility. He takes a small, heavy adze, its blade honed to a razor's edge, and begins the slow process of clearing the ice. The movement is rhythmic and meditative, a short, sharp stroke that chips away at the frozen shell. Each strike produces a spray of tiny, translucent shards that catch the orange light of the brazier, looking like a shower of sparks before they settle back into the indigo shadows. The sound of the adze meeting the ice is a sharp, percussive tack, a high-pitched note that stands in contrast to the low, monochromatic moan of the wind. It is a boring, repetitive labor, an accumulation of small movements that eventually reveal the dark, oily grain of the wood beneath. The wood of the sleeper is a deep, saturated brown, the color of wet earth and old shadows. It smells of creosote and the deep, resinous heart of the forest. As the ice is cleared, the layer uses a heavy, heated iron bar to melt the remaining frost from the pilot holes. The steam that rises from the wood is thick and white, a momentary veil that obscures the light of the lantern. It carries the sharp, medicinal tang of the preservative, a scent that lingers in the air and clings to the fabric of his coat. The visual of the steam is rendered with a very light application of a white pastel, smudged with a fingertip to create a soft, ethereal texture that seems to float on top of the dark blue background. It is a moment of atmospheric transition, a fleeting intersection of heat and cold that defines the boundary of the work. He returns to the brazier and retrieves a warmed spike. The metal is no longer cold to the touch. It carries a dull, heavy heat that can be felt through the leather of his gloves. He carries it back to the rail, his shadow lengthening as he moves away from the fire, a dark, elongated figure that seems to be reaching for the mountains. He places the spike against the iron flange of the rail, the point finding the softened wood of the pilot hole. The first strike of the sledgehammer is a gentle one, a setting of the metal that produces a low, hollow thud. The second strike is more purposeful, a heavy descent of the hammer head that drives the spike an inch into the timber. The heat from the spike causes a faint hiss as it meets the frozen moisture within the wood, a tiny, microscopic sound of displacement that is lost in the vastness of the tundra. The rhythm of the hammer becomes the heartbeat of the night. One strike, then a pause for the breath to clear the air. 2 strikes, then a slight adjustment of the posture. 3 strikes, and the spike is home. The vibration travels up the layer's arms, a jarring resonance that he feels in his teeth and in the small of his back. It is a physical dialogue between the man, the iron, and the mountain. The ground does not want to accept the spike, and the hammer does not want to fall, but the duty compels the motion. It is a history of resistance and persistence, a story told in the slow-motion compression of wood fibers and the steady application of force. There is no climax to the work, no moment of grand completion. There is only the next spike, and the one after that, an infinite sequence of identical tasks that stretch out into the darkness. The visual style of the drawing captures this repetition with a sense of heavy, tactile permanence. The strokes of the colored pencil are thick and layered, creating a surface that looks like it could be felt with the fingertips. The indigo of the sky is built up from layers of navy, violet, and charcoal, a depth of color that suggests the immense weight of the atmosphere. The lantern light is a warm, grainy yellow, its edges smudged into the blue to create a sense of distance and atmosphere. The snow is not a flat white, but a complex tapestry of pale blues, grays, and ochres, reflecting the various light sources and the deep shadows of the drifts. Every line is deliberate and slow, mirroring the pace of the narrative and the movements of the iron railway layer. As the hour grows later, the cold seems to intensify, a sharpening of the air that makes every movement a struggle. The brazier's coals are beginning to dim, the orange light receding into a deep, glowing red. The layer adds another piece of wood to the fire, the sound of the dry branch snapping a sharp report in the silence. He watches as the flames take hold, a small, dancing geometry of heat that casts flickering shadows against the side of the supply sled. These shadows are erratic and lively, a stark contrast to the heavy, static presence of the mountains. He takes a moment to warm his hands over the coals, the heat a stinging, painful sensation as the blood begins to move more freely in his fingers. It is a brief respite, a small window of sensory awareness before the numbness returns. The wind has picked up again, a low, haunting whistle that seems to come from the very peaks of the mountains. It carries with it a fine, dry snow that looks like powdered chalk in the air. The snow settles on the iron rails, a thin, white line that traces the path of the track into the darkness. It settles on the man's shoulders and on the brim of his hat, a silent accumulation that speaks to the patience of the winter. He does not brush it off. It is a part of the world now, a layer of the drawing that cannot be removed. He picks up the hammer once more, the weight of it familiar and exhausting. The iron head is cold, the wood of the handle feeling like a piece of the permafrost itself. He moves to the next spike, his boots crunching in the snow with a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence that matches the pulse of the night. The history of the iron railway is not written in books, but in the specific tension of the spikes and the alignment of the rails. It is a boring history, a record of thousands of identical movements performed in the face of an indifferent wilderness. Each spike is a word, each sleeper a sentence, and the railway itself a long, winding narrative of human endurance. The man is the scribe, his hammer the pen, and the frozen earth the page. He works with a quiet, uncomplaining diligence, his mind as still as the mountains that surround him. There is no thought of the world beyond the circle of the lantern light, no vision of the trains that will one day traverse this line. There is only the iron, the snow, and the steady, heavy fall of the hammer into the silence. The lantern's flame flickers, the oil burning low, the light casting a long, trembling shadow across the newly driven spike. The shadow looks like a mark made with a soft, dark charcoal, a smudge on the pristine surface of the snow. The layer pauses, his hand resting on the head of the hammer, his breath a slow and steady cloud of vapor. He looks out into the indigo void, where the next rail waits in the darkness, a dark line of potential against the pale blue of the drifts. The mountain is a silent, hulking witness, its peaks lost in the heavy clouds that promise more snow. The world is at peace, a frozen tableau of labor and stillness, a dark drawing that continues to grow, layer by layer, in the heart of the infinite winter. The track gauge is a long, slender bar of seasoned hardwood tipped with heavy brass caps, a tool of absolute precision in a world of imprecise and shifting elements. It is the arbiter of the line, the final authority that dictates the distance between the two parallel threads of iron that are slowly being stitched across the mountain's flank. In the visual rendering of this moment, the gauge bar is a horizontal stroke of pale, muted gold against the suffocating indigo of the background. The brass ends are tarnished, their once bright surfaces now a dull, weathered ochre that suggests the patina of age and the constant friction of labor. In the soft, grainy light of the lantern, the bar casts a thin, needle-like shadow that cuts across the textured surface of the snow, a shadow that looks like a single, sharp mark made with a hard lead pencil on a dark, toothy paper. The layer picks it up with a slow and deliberate grace, his fingers feeling the grain of the wood through his gloves, a texture that is rough and dry, holding the chill of the atmosphere in its fibers. The measurement is a ritual of stillness. He lays the gauge across the two rails, the brass caps meeting the inner edges of the steel with a faint metallic clack that is immediately absorbed by the heavy, damp air. The sound is small, insignificant, yet it carries the weight of the entire project. If the distance is wrong by even a fraction of an inch, the future locomotives will find no purchase here. They will be betrayed by the very iron meant to carry them. He kneels in the snow, his knees sinking into the soft, blue-tinted powder until he feels the hard, unyielding resistance of the permafrost beneath. The cold travels through his heavy trousers, a slow and methodical invasion of his senses that he acknowledges without emotion. His eyes, narrowed against the thin, crystalline dust that the wind carries, focus on the small notch in the center of the bar. It is a moment of pure, boring observation, a suspension of time where the only thing in existence is the relationship between two pieces of metal and a stick of wood. The history of this measurement, 4 feet, 8.5 inches, is a history of repetition and ancient standards, a legacy that traces its way back through the centuries to the wheel ruts of forgotten empires. Here, in the heart of the winter mountains, that history feels like a heavy, invisible chain. The layer is a link in that chain, his body a conduit for a standard that was decided in a world far warmer and more crowded than this one. He checks the gauge at the first sleeper, then the second, then the third. It is a slow, rhythmic crawl, a movement that mirrors the pace of the shifting glaciers above. The world is reduced to these increments, a sequence of checks and balances that require no imagination, only the steady, unblinking application of the rule. The boredom of the task is its own kind of protection, a mental fog that keeps the vast, terrifying emptiness of the mountain at bay. The visual style of the scene emphasizes this sense of repetitive, microscopic focus. The artist has used a series of fine, overlapping hatch marks to create the texture of the iron rails, each stroke a testament to the weight and density of the material. The lantern light is a warm, grainy yellow that spills across the snow in a circular wash, its edges smudged into the deep violet and indigo of the night. Within this circle, the frost on the rails looks like a layer of white chalk applied with a light, trembling hand. Outside the circle, the world is a mystery of shadows and smudges, a dark surface where the forms of the mountains are only suggested by the absence of stars. The contrast is stark, a chiaroscuro of the frozen wilderness where the only reality is the immediate proximity of the gauge and the iron. To adjust the rail, he uses a heavy, forged iron lever, its handle long and tapered for maximum mechanical advantage. The lever is cold, a deep and penetrating cold that seems to vibrate in the air around it. He slides the tip of the lever beneath the flange of the rail. The metal-on-metal sound, a low, grinding groan that feels like the mountain itself is complaining. He leans his weight into the handle, a slow-motion exertion of force that is measured in ounces. The rail moves with a reluctant, jerky motion, the ice beneath it cracking with a sound like a distant gunshot. The movement is so small it is almost imperceptible, a shifting of the iron by the width of a single hair. He checks the gauge again. The brass cap meets the steel. The fit is now perfect. He repeats the process on the other side, a mirror image of the labor, a symmetrical application of effort in a world of lopsided drifts and jagged peaks. The wind has a specific texture now, a graininess that suggests it is carrying the very essence of the stone it has eroded. It brushes against the layer's face, a constant, abrasive presence that numbs the skin and waters the eyes. The tears that form in the corners of his eyes freeze almost instantly, becoming tiny, crystalline pearls that cling to his eyelashes. He does not wipe them away. He has learned that movement is a waste of heat. He simply blinks, a slow and heavy motion of the lids that feels like the movement of a rusted shutter. His breath is a constant, rhythmic plume of vapor, a gray-white cloud that momentarily obscures the gauge before being pulled away by the draft. The vapor is rendered with the softest application of a pale pastel, a smudge of light that seems to have no weight, a ghostly counterpoint to the heavy, solid reality of the iron. As he moves along the track, the silence of the mountain begins to take on a tonal quality, a low-frequency hum that he feels in his chest more than he hears in his ears. It is the sound of the Earth's crust being compressed by the weight of the ice, a geological groan that has no beginning and no end. The railway is a thin, fragile thread laid across this groaning giant, a work of art made of steel and wood that is being slowly and methodically constructed. The boredom of the work is its greatest virtue. It allows the mind to settle into a state of heavy, dreamless observation. There is no room for fear or hope, only the next measurement, the next levering of the iron, the next breath. The history of the railway is being written in these silent, repetitive acts, a narrative of endurance that is as long and as winding as the track itself. The lantern's flame is a small, flickering pulse of amber, a tiny spark of life in a world of frozen shadows. It consumes the oil with a slow, steady hiss, a sound that is the only constant in the shifting darkness. The light catches the edge of the gauge bar, creating a shimmering highlight that looks like a stroke of white pencil on a dark board. The shadows are deep and layered, built up from shades of charcoal, navy, and slate. They dance across the snow in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, mirroring the movements of the layer as he kneels and rises, kneels and rises. The geometry of the shadows is a study in perspective, the long lines of the rails disappearing into the smudged horizon, a vanishing point that leads into the heart of the infinite night. The sleepers beneath the gauge are dark, heavy rectangles of wood, their surfaces etched with the grain of their former lives. They smell of creosote and old, damp earth, a scent that is both comforting and oppressive. They are cold to the touch, but it is a different kind of cold than the iron, a dull, absorbent chill that seems to draw the very life from the ground. As the layer moves the gauge from one sleeper to the next, he can feel the subtle variations in the height of the wood, the minute inconsistencies that he must account for with thin shims of cedar. These shims are like the small, delicate details in a drawing, the tiny marks that provide the final layer of realism. He slides a shim into place with a slow, deliberate movement, the wood meeting the iron with a soft, muffled sound. The night is a vast, indigo sea, and the layer is a solitary mariner navigating by the light of a single, flickering star. The mountain is his ocean, a world of shifting drifts and frozen waves that he must cross with the heavy, unyielding weight of the iron. Time has lost its meaning, becoming a circular loop of measurement and adjustment, a sequence of events that has no climax and no resolution. There is only the line, the beautiful, straight line of the railway as it cuts through the chaos of the wilderness. It is a boring history, a slow and methodical recording of the passage of inches and the accumulation of hours. The drawings are never finished. They are only added to, layer upon layer of dark pigment and soft light, building a world that is as beautiful as it is desolate. He pauses for a moment, his hand resting on the center of the gauge bar. He does not look up at the stars, nor does he look back at the track he has already measured. He looks only at the point where the brass meets the steel. The light from the lantern is reflected in the polished surface of the brass, a tiny, distorted image of the flame. It is a moment of profound, quiet clarity, a realization of the weight and the beauty of the task. The wind moans again, a low, monochromatic sound that lulls the senses into a deeper state of numbness. He picks up the gauge and moves to the next sleeper, his boots crunching in the snow with a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence that matches the pulse of the night. The history of the iron continues, one measurement at a time, one breath at a time, a slow and steady progression into the heart of the winter. The ballast, a vast and silent river of crushed basalt and dark granite, lies in heavy, frozen heaps alongside the newly laid track, waiting to be distributed beneath and between the sleepers. It is the silent partner of the iron, the coarse and unyielding foundation that prevents the railway from sinking into the shifting, thawing whims of the earth. In the visual language of this world, the ballast is rendered with thousands of tiny, sharp strokes of a dark charcoal pencil, each mark representing a single shard of stone. The surface of these heaps is textured and rough, a landscape of miniature peaks and valleys that catch the dim, amber wash of the lantern light. The shadows between the stones are deep and absolute, a saturated indigo that suggests the infinite depth of the mountain night. The artist has layered the colors here with a heavy hand, building up the darkness until the stone seems to have a weight that transcends the paper itself. The layer stands before one of these mounds, his shovel held in a loose, practiced grip, his body a study in stillness as he prepares for the most grueling and monotonous phase of the labor. The shovel is a heavy tool, its blade wide and slightly curved, forged from a single piece of carbon steel that has been tempered to withstand the abrasive nature of the rock. The edge of the blade is polished to a dull, silver sheen by the constant friction of the stone, reflecting the lantern's flame in a series of distorted, flickering highlights. The handle is made of ash, a wood chosen for its strength and its ability to absorb vibration, though in this cold it feels as rigid and unforgiving as a bar of iron. The layer's gloves are worn thin at the palms, the leather stained with the dark dust of the basalt and the gray rime of the frost. As he thrusts the shovel into the mound, the sound is a harsh, grinding scritch, a noise that seems to vibrate through the very air, carrying with it the smell of pulverized minerals and old, dry earth. It is a sound of pure resistance, a reminder of the raw, elemental struggle between human intent and the inertia of the physical world. The movement of distributing the ballast is a slow-motion choreography of endurance. He lifts a shovelful of stone, the weight of it pulling at his shoulders and the base of his spine with a steady, relentless pressure. The stone is heavy, its density a testament to its volcanic origins, born in the heat of the earth but now surrendered to the absolute zero of the tundra. He swings the shovel in a low, controlled arc, the stones cascading into the spaces between the sleepers with a sound like heavy rain falling on a wooden roof. The sound is muffled by the snow, a rhythmic thudding that marks the passage of time in the absence of a clock. Each shovelful is identical to the last, a repetition that lulls the mind into a state of heavy, dreamless observation. There is no haste, for haste is an enemy of the body in the thin, freezing air. There is only the steady, mechanical application of force, a cycle of lift, swing, and release that continues until the world itself seems to be composed of nothing but the gray dust of the stone and the blue shadows of the night. Once the ballast is distributed, the process of tamping begins. This is a task of minute microscopic adjustments, the slow settling of the sleepers into their permanent beds. The tool for this is the tamping bar, a long, heavy rod of iron with a flattened, wedge-shaped end. It is a primitive and powerful instrument, designed to pack the stone tightly beneath the timber until the track is level and true. The layer grips the bar with both hands, his knuckles white beneath the leather of his gloves. He drives the wedge into the ballast at the edge of a sleeper, the impact sending a jarring vibration through his arms and into his chest. The sound is a dull, percussive thwack, a note of finality that echoes briefly against the dark, indigo slopes of the surrounding peaks before being swallowed by the wind. It is a boring, repetitive labor, an accumulation of thousands of strikes that eventually result in a foundation of absolute stability. The visuals of the tamping process are a study in the texture of shadows and the play of light on rough surfaces. The lantern sits on a nearby sleeper, its flame a small, fragile pulse of warmth in the vast, unblinking cold. The light catches the dust kicked up by the tamping bar, creating a faint, golden haze that hangs in the air like a ghostly veil. This haze is rendered with the lightest application of a pale ochre pastel, smudged with a steady finger to create a sense of depth and atmosphere. The shadows of the tamping bar are long and rhythmic, dancing across the stones with every strike, their edges soft and blurred by the grain of the dark paper. The world beyond the lantern's reach is a mystery of smudged indigo and charcoal, a place where the mountains and the sky are indistinguishable from one another. It is a landscape of profound stillness, a world where the only thing moving is the heavy, rhythmic fall of the iron bar and the slow, steady plume of the layer's breath. The history of the ballast is a history of the earth itself, a narrative of erosion, pressure, and time. These stones were once part of a mountain range that stood millions of years ago, ground down by glaciers and wind until they were reduced to the jagged shards that now support the railway. The layer does not think of this history, but he feels the weight of it in every shovelful. He is a part of that geological process, a temporary agent of displacement in a world that moves in increments of centuries. The railway is a thin, human thread laid across this ancient foundation, a work of art made of steel and stone that is being slowly and methodically constructed. The boredom of the work is a form of respect, a quiet acknowledgement of the time and effort required to impose order upon the chaos of the wilderness. The air remains cold, a heavy and atmospheric pressure that settles into every crease of the clothing and every pore of the skin. The wind carries a fine, dry snow that looks like powdered chalk in the dim light, settling on the dark surfaces of the ballast, and the iron rails with a silent, persistent accumulation. This snow is like the white highlights in a drawing, applied with a quick, decisive stroke of a pale pastel to create a sense of texture and light. It traces the edges of the stones and the grain of the wood, a delicate filigree of ice that contrasts with the heavy, solid reality of the work. The layer does not brush the snow away. He allows it to become a part of the environment, a layer of the drawing that cannot be removed. He moves with a slowness that mirrors the freezing of the water in the mountain streams, his body a machine of survival and labor. The internal state of the layer is one of profound, quiet isolation. The cold has a way of turning the mind inward, creating a small, dark space where the only sounds are the heartbeat and the rhythmic, rasping pull of the air through the scarf. There are no thoughts of the future, no visions of the locomotives that will one day thunder over this track. There is only the immediate reality of the stone, the iron, and the weight of the bar. It is a meditative state, a suspension of the self in the service of the duty. The history being recorded here is not one of empires or wars, but of the specific density of the basalt and the precise alignment of the sleepers. It is a history of the physical world, told in the language of friction and gravity, a narrative that moves at the speed of the iron as it inches across the frozen earth. The lantern's flame flickers again, the oil burning low, the light casting a long, trembling shadow across the newly tamped stone. The shadow looks like a mark made with a soft, dark charcoal, a smudge on the pristine surface of the snow. The layer pauses, his hand resting on the head of the tamping bar, his breath a slow and steady cloud of vapor. He looks out into the indigo void, where the next mound of ballast waits in the darkness, a dark heap of potential against the pale blue of the drifts. The mountain is a silent, hulking witness, its peaks lost in the heavy clouds that promise more snow. The world is at peace, a frozen tableau of labor and stillness, a dark drawing that continues to grow, layer by layer, in the heart of the infinite winter. As he prepares for the next shovelful, the silence of the mountain seems to deepen, becoming a resonant, physical presence. It is a silence that carries the weight of the stars and the depth of the valleys, a silence that lulls the senses into a state of profound calm. The boredom of the task is its own kind of music, a monochromatic melody of scritch and thwack that defines the boundaries of the night. The layer takes up the shovel once more, the weight of it familiar and exhausting, his movements a slow and steady counterpoint to the entropy of the winter. The iron is laid, the stone is packed, and the line moves forward, one heavy, rhythmic step at a time, into the deep and beautiful darkness of the mountain night. The history of the iron railway continues, one stone at a time, one breath at a time, a slow and steady progression into the heart of the winter. The texture of the stone beneath his feet is uneven and demanding, requiring a constant, subtle adjustment of his balance. Each step is a negotiation with gravity, the sharp edges of the basalt biting into the soles of his boots. The sound of his movement is a crunching, rhythmic noise that echoes briefly against the side of the supply sled. The sled itself is a dark, heavy shape in the periphery of his vision, its wooden runners encrusted with a thick layer of ice. It stands as a silent monument to the materials of progress, a repository of iron and wood that is slowly being depleted as the line moves forward. The visual of the sled is rendered with thick, waxy strokes of a dark pencil, its form emerging from the indigo shadows like a ghost from the past. It is a part of the drawing, a fixed element in a world of shifting snow and howling wind. He looks at the section of track he has just completed, the iron rails sitting proud on their bed of dark, tamped stone. In the lantern light, the structure has a geometric beauty, a series of straight lines and right angles that cut through the organic chaos of the mountain. It is a small, significant victory of order over entropy, a testament to the power of human endurance. The blue and gray tones of the drawing emphasize the cold and the stillness of the scene, the warm amber of the lantern the only hint of a world beyond the ice. It is a beautiful, lonely sight, a single stroke of a pencil across a dark page, a mark of intent in a world that knows no names. The history of the railway is being written in these increments, a long and winding story that has no end, only the next rail, the next sleeper, and the next heavy heave of the iron against the snow. The deepest watch of the night has arrived, a time when the world ceases to be a place of movement and becomes instead a vast, frozen monument to stillness. The sky is no longer merely indigo. It has deepened into a bruised charcoal black that feels as thick and heavy as the iron rails themselves. In this hour, the mountains do not loom. They press, their immense, silent weight squeezing the very light from the stars. The visual composition of this moment would be rendered by an artist who has spent hours building up layers of dark, waxy pigment, pressing the colored pencil so hard against the dark surface that the paper itself begins to shine with a dull, oily sheen. The horizon is a series of soft, smudged gradients, where the indigo of the peaks bleeds into the slate gray of the clouds, creating a world without sharp edges, a world where every form is suggested by the depth of its shadow. The railway layer stands in the center of this darkness, his lantern a tiny, flickering amber tear in an ocean of cold. He is no longer working with the hammer or the shovel. Now, he is a ghost of inspection, moving with a slow, mechanical grace along the line he has built, his boots making a soft, rhythmic crunching sound in the frozen crust of the snow. He carries a small, long-handled inspection hammer, the head made of polished steel that has turned the color of a winter sky. It is a light tool, meant not for force but for sound. He stoops low, his shadow stretching out across the sleepers like a long, dark finger, and taps the side of the rail. The sound is a high-pitched, metallic ping that vibrates through the frigid air, a clean and solitary note that speaks to the integrity of the iron. If the sound were dull, it would mean the metal had cracked in the cold or that a bolt had loosened its grip. But the iron is true. It sings in the darkness, a cold, crystalline melody that matches the humming of the wind. He moves to the next joint, his pace deliberate and unchanging, a human metronome measuring the rhythm of the track. The repetition of the sound, step, tap, ping, step, tap, ping, is a hypnotic sequence that lulls the mind into a state of heavy, dreamless suspension. It is a boring, vital task, a history told in the vibrations of the steel. The rime frost has begun to form on the surface of the rails in intricate, fern-like patterns. These crystals are the work of a slow and patient atmosphere, growing molecule by molecule, as the moisture in the air surrenders to the absolute zero of the mountain night. In the amber wash of the lantern light, the frost looks like a layer of white pastel, applied with 1,000 tiny, vertical strokes. It is fragile and beautiful, a temporary decoration on the permanent iron. As the layer taps the rail, the vibration causes a small shower of these crystals to fall away, disappearing into the indigo shadows of the ballast. He watches their descent with a quiet, unblinking focus, his eyes tracking the slow-motion collapse of the ice. Everything in this world happens in slow motion. The falling of the frost, the drifting of the snow, the turning of the earth. It is a landscape where time has been stretched thin, becoming a single, continuous moment of cold. The visual style of the drawing emphasizes the textures of this frozen labor. The wool of the layer's coat is rendered with a cross-hatching of deep grays and blacks, the texture appearing rough and heavy, as if it could absorb the very silence of the peaks. The lantern's glow is not a bright light, but a soft, grainy yellow that fades quickly into the surrounding blue. It creates a small sanctuary of visibility, a tiny stage where the drama of the iron and the frost is played out. The artist has used a white pencil to create the sharp, shimmering highlights on the edges of the hammer and the bolts, marks that look like flashes of flint in the dark. These highlights are the only things that break the monochromatic gloom, tiny pinpricks of reality in a world of indigo smudges. The snow is a complex tapestry of pale blues and violets, reflecting the sky and the shadows of the mountains in a way that makes it seem deeper than it truly is. As he moves, the layer feels the cold contracting the world around him. The iron rails are shrinking, pulling against their bolts with a silent molecular force. The sleepers are hardening, the creosote within them turning into a substance as brittle as glass. His own body is following suit, his joints stiffening and his breath coming in slow, heavy pulls that feel like he is inhaling powdered ice. He is a part of the contraction, a part of the mountain's slow withdrawal into itself. The duty is the only thing that keeps him moving, a small, glowing coal of purpose kept alive in the center of his chest. It is a quiet, unspeaking thing, devoid of pride or ambition. It is simply the necessity of the next step, the next tap, the next breath. He does not think of the morning. He does not think of the end of the line. He thinks only of the sound of the hammer against the steel, a sound that confirms his existence in the face of the infinite. The wind has dropped to a low, mournful sigh, a sound that seems to come from deep within the stone of the mountains. It carries with it the scent of the high glaciers, a smell that is metallic, old, and utterly devoid of life. It is the smell of time itself, a dry and ancient aroma that fills the lungs and numbs the senses. The silence that follows the wind is even more profound, a heavy, ringing stillness that presses against the ears. In this silence, the layer can hear the beating of his own heart, a slow and rhythmic thud that matches the pace of his boots. He is the only thing moving in this vast, indigo theater, a solitary figure in a dark drawing, a mark of human intent on a landscape of ice. The history of the railway is being written in these silent, repetitive acts of inspection, a narrative of endurance that is as long and as winding as the track itself. He pauses at a junction where the rails have been joined with extra heavy fish plates. He kneels in the snow, the cold of the ground a familiar, dull pressure against his knees. He runs a gloved hand over the surface of the iron, feeling the smooth, cold metal and the hard edges of the bolts. The leather of his glove is stiff with frozen grease, making the movement clumsy and slow. He checks the tension of the nuts by sight, the lantern light reflecting off the hexagonal surfaces in a series of dull, oily highlights. Everything is in its place. The railway is a line of absolute logic, a horizontal constant in a vertical world. Each bolt, each spike, each shard of ballast is a word in a sentence that will eventually span the entire continent. It is a boring history, a slow and methodical recording of the passage of minutes and the accumulation of inches. But it is a history that will endure long after the man and his lantern have been forgotten. The sky above is a void of textured charcoal, the clouds so low they seem to touch the peaks. There are no stars visible now, only the deep, velvety blackness of the space beyond. It is a world without a ceiling, a world that stretches upward forever into the dark. The layer looks up for a moment, his breath a thick, white plume that drifts toward the heavens. He feels a sense of staggering isolation, a realization of the scale of the wilderness and the insignificance of his own presence. But the feeling is not one of fear, it is one of peace. In the absolute cold and the absolute silence, there is no room for the complications of the world. There is only the iron, the snow, and the duty. He is a part of the drawing, a figure rendered in the same dark tones as the mountains, his form a series of heavy, purposeful marks on the dark surface of the night. The lantern's flame flickers, the oil thickening in the cold, the light dimming for a heartbeat before flaring back to life. It casts a long, trembling shadow across the newly inspected rail, a shadow that looks like a stroke of a soft, dark pencil. The layer rises from his knees, a slow and creaking movement of his joints that sounds like the breaking of a dry branch. He picks up the lantern and moves forward again, the light revealing the next section of the track. The shadows dance and shift, the long, dark lines of the sleepers appearing and disappearing in the amber wash. He begins to move toward the next joint, his boots crunching in the snow with a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence. The world remains a dark, textured drawing, a place of indigo shadows and warm, flickering light. The history of the iron continues, one tap at a time, one breath at a time, a slow and steady progression into the heart of the winter. The texture of the snow under his boots has changed, becoming harder and more crystalline as the temperature continues to drop. It crackles with a high-pitched, brittle sound, like the breaking of tiny glass ornaments. Each step is a careful negotiation with the surface, a slow-motion balancing act that requires his full attention. The mind does not wander. It stays focused on the immediate, the boring, the repetitive. The inspection of the line is a meditation on permanence, a quiet acknowledgement of the weight and the beauty of the task. He is a builder of lines in a world of circles, a man who is stitching the earth together with threads of steel. The drawing of this scene is never finished. It is only added to, layer upon layer of dark pigment and soft light, building a world that is as beautiful as it is desolate, as hypnotic as it is exhausting. As he reaches the end of the newly laid section, he turns and looks back. The track stretches out behind him, a straight and true line that disappears into the smudged indigo of the distance. In the dim light, the rails look like two shimmering threads of silver, a mark of human intent that cuts through the chaos of the mountain. It is a beautiful, lonely sight, a testament to the power of silent endurance. The wind moans again, a low, monochromatic sound that lulls the senses into a deeper state of numbness. He takes a moment to simply breathe, the cold air filling his lungs and grounding him in the reality of the night. The history of the iron railway is not written in books, but in the specific tension of the spikes and the alignment of the rails. It is a boring history, but it is his history, a story told in the language of the winter and the steel. The lantern's flame is a small, defiant act of presence in the face of the vast, unblinking eye of the mountains. He grips the handle, the cold of the iron familiar and reassuring. He begins the long walk back to the supply sled, his movements heavy and deliberate, his shadow trailing behind him like a ghost. The world is at peace, a frozen tableau of labor and stillness, a dark drawing that continues to grow in the heart of the infinite winter. Each step is a repetition of the last, a loop of sound and motion that carries him forward through the indigo night. The iron is inspected, the line is true, and the duty remains. He moves through the shadows, a shadow himself, a part of the mountain and the sky, a builder of dreams made of iron and snow. The hour of the false dawn arrives not with light, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the texture of the darkness. The indigo of the sky, which had reached a state of near-absolute saturation, begins to bleed into a slightly lighter shade of charcoal gray, as if the artist has begun to smudge the heavy pencil marks with a soft, dry cloth. This is the hour when the cold becomes a living entity, a heavy and atmospheric presence that settles into the very hollows of the landscape. It is a period of profound atmospheric stasis, where the world seems to hold its breath, waiting for a sun that remains a distant and unlikely memory. In the visual style of this narrative, the scene is a study in desaturation. The deep, waxy blues are now layered with a film of pale slate gray, creating a sense of distance and occlusion. The lantern's flame, now burning low and flickering with a rhythmic, tired pulse, is a single, isolated spark of amber in a world of monochromatic gloom. The railway layer stands beside the supply sled, his form a dark silhouette against the pale, blue-tinted crust of the drifts, his body a monument to the slow and methodical passage of time. He turns his attention to the maintenance of his tools, a task of quiet necessity that occupies the long minutes of the transition. He takes up a small, tin oil can, its surface dented and darkened by years of contact with the iron and the earth. The oil within is thick and sluggish, its viscosity increased by the absolute zero of the mountain air. As he tips the can, the oil emerges in a slow, translucent amber bead that clings to the spout for a heartbeat before dropping onto the threads of a heavy bolt. The sound of the drop hitting the metal is a minute microscopic clink, a sound so small it is almost swallowed by the vast, ringing silence of the tundra. He spreads the oil with a piece of rough, oil-soaked burlap, the movement slow and rhythmic. The scent of the oil is heavy and industrial, a smell of lubricants and friction that cuts through the sterile, frozen air. In the drawing, this oil is represented by a slightly glossier application of a dark umber pastel, a subtle variation in texture that suggests the presence of moisture in a world of dry ice. The sledgehammer rests against the wooden runner of the sled, its handle white with a thick layer of rime frost. He takes a piece of coarse sandpaper from his pocket and begins to work on the wood, a slow and meditative process of smoothing out the grain. The sound of the sandpaper against the ash is a rhythmic, abrasive scratching, a shhhshhh sound that matches the pace of his breathing. Each stroke removes a fine dust of wood and ice, a pale powder that settles onto the indigo surface of the snow. He works with a level of focus that borders on the hypnotic, his eyes tracking the movement of his hand across the handle. There is no urgency in the work, only the steady, unblinking application of effort. The boredom of the task is its own kind of sanctuary, a mental space where the only thing that matters is the smoothness of the wood and the rhythm of the stroke. The history of the railway is recorded in these small acts of maintenance, in the preparation of the tools that will drive the iron further into the wilderness. The sky continues its slow transition, the clouds above the peaks taking on a slightly more defined shape. They are heavy, rolling masses of graphite and slate, their undersides smudged with the deep violet of the departing night. The mountains emerge from the shadows as hulking, textured shapes, their features rendered with the side of a soft charcoal pencil. There is no warmth in this emerging world, only a different kind of cold, a cold that is visible and structural. The layer moves to the brazier, which has now reached its final state of decline. The coals are a deep, glowing crimson, buried beneath a thick layer of pale gray ash. He stirs the embers with a long iron rod, the movement producing a faint, whispering hiss as the heat meets the frozen air. A few sparks rise from the fire, tiny pinpricks of orange that dance briefly in the indigo gloom before vanishing into the dark. These sparks are like the final, defiant marks of a warm pencil on a cold surface, a momentary interruption in the monochromatic stillness. He prepares the final set of fish plates for the night's work, his movements heavy and deliberate. These iron plates are cold to the core, their weight a constant and unyielding presence. He cleans the bolt holes with a wire brush, the sound a sharp, percussive rasping that echoes briefly against the side of the sled. The dust of the iron is a fine, dark powder that clings to his gloves and the fabric of his sleeves. He lines the plates up in the snow, arranging them with a level of precision that feels geological. The visual composition of the scene emphasizes this order. The straight lines of the iron, the rectangular blocks of the sleepers, and the circular wash of the lantern light. It is a geometry of endurance, a human architecture imposed upon the chaotic and shifting drifts of the mountain. The artist has used a series of fine, overlapping hatch marks to create the texture of the snow, building up the surface until it looks as hard and as permanent as stone. The wind has shifted again, now coming from the high glaciers in a steady, monochromatic stream. It carries with it the sound of grinding ice and the smell of ancient, frozen water. It pushes against the layer with a passive, unrelenting force, a steady hand that tries to nudge him toward sleep. He resists the wind with the same stoicism he has shown throughout the night, his body a heavy anchor in the shifting air. His breath is a constant, rhythmic plume of vapor, a gray-white cloud that momentarily obscures his vision before being pulled away by the draft. This vapor is rendered with the softest application of a white pastel, a smudge of light that seems to have no weight, a ghostly counterpoint to the solid reality of the tools and the iron. The history of this place is a history of such breaths, of the individual moments of life kept alive in the heart of the winter. He takes up a heavy iron crowbar and moves to the last rail that has been set but not yet fully secured. The rail lies in the snow like a long, dark spine, its surface coated in a fine dust of frost. He slides the tip of the bar beneath the flange, his boots bracing against the packed snow. The movement is a slow-motion exertion of force, a heavy heave that causes the iron to groan and shift with a sound like a distant tectonic plate moving. The resistance of the rail is absolute, a stubborn refusal to be moved from its frozen bed. But the layer persists, his muscles straining against the weight, his mind focused on the fraction of an inch that must be gained. This is the essence of the boring history, the slow and methodical struggle for inches, the accumulation of minute victories over the course of an entire night. The visual style of the drawing captures this struggle with a sense of heavy, tactile permanence. The strokes of the colored pencil are thick and layered, creating a surface that looks like it has been built up over centuries. The indigo of the sky is so deep it feels like an ocean, a volume of darkness that could drown the world. The lantern light is a warm, grainy yellow, its edges smudged into the blue to create a sense of distance and atmosphere. The snow is not a flat white, but a complex tapestry of pale blues, grays, and ochres, reflecting the various light sources and the deep shadows of the drifts. Every line is deliberate and slow, mirroring the pace of the narrative and the movements of the iron railway layer. The scene is a frozen tableau of labor, a dark drawing that continues to grow, layer by layer, in the heart of the infinite winter. The layer pauses, his hand resting on the cold steel of the crowbar. He looks out toward the horizon, where the first hint of the true dawn remains hidden behind the heavy, graphite clouds. He feels a sense of profound, quiet isolation, a realization of the scale of the mountains and the insignificance of his own presence. But the feeling is not one of despair, it is one of peace. In the absolute cold and the absolute silence, there is no room for the complications of the world beyond the peaks. There is only the iron, the snow, and the duty. He is a part of the drawing, a figure rendered in the same dark tones as the landscape, his form a series of heavy, purposeful marks on the dark surface of the night. The history of the railway is being written in these silent, repetitive acts, a narrative of endurance that is as long and as winding as the track itself. As the hour of the false dawn passes, the cold seems to intensify one final time, a sharpening of the air that makes every movement a struggle. The brazier's coals are now entirely covered in ash, the last of the red light gone. The layer adds nothing to the fire. He has no more wood, and the time for heat has passed. He picks up the lantern, the handle cold and familiar in his grip, and begins to gather the remaining tools back onto the sled. The sound of the iron hitting the wood of the sled is a series of dull, rhythmic thuds, a sound of closure for the night's labor. He works with a slow and steady grace, his movements a mirror of the freezing of the mountain streams. The railway now extends another 100 yards into the darkness, a straight and true line of iron and wood that marks the progress of the night. The visual of the track stretching into the gloom is a beautiful, lonely sight. The two rails look like shimmering threads of silver, catching the faint, charcoal light of the sky. They are a mark of human intent that cuts through the chaos of the wilderness, a testament to the power of silent endurance. The history of the iron railway is not written in grand gestures, but in the specific tension of the bolts and the alignment of the sleepers. It is a boring history, but it is a permanent one, a story told in the language of the winter and the steel. The layer takes a moment to look back at the work, his breath a slow and steady cloud of vapor. He is satisfied. The line is true. The iron is set. The lantern's flame flickers, the oil nearly gone, the light casting a long, trembling shadow across the newly laid track. The shadow looks like a mark made with a soft, dark pencil, a smudge on the pristine surface of the snow. The layer turns and begins the long, heavy pull of the sled back toward the distant camp, his boots crunching in the snow with a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence. The world remains a dark, textured drawing, a place of indigo shadows and pale, charcoal light. The history of the iron continues, one step at a time, one breath at a time, a slow and steady progression toward the end of the night. There is no end to the cold, and no end to the duty, only the next rail and the next winter. The transition from the deep, waxy indigo of the night to the pale, exhausted slate of the morning is not a sudden event, but a slow and agonizingly gradual erasure of the shadows. It is the final layer of the drawing, where the artist takes a hard, gray pastel and lightens the sky just enough to reveal the true scale of the isolation. The sky does not become bright. It merely becomes visible, a flat and heavy ceiling of unpolished lead that seems to rest directly upon the peaks of the mountains. In this light, the world loses its mystery and replaces it with a stark, monochromatic reality. The deep blues of the night are replaced by shades of ash, charcoal, and bone white. The railway layer stands at the end of the newly laid track, his body a dark, motionless pillar against the vast and indifferent landscape. His breath is no longer a ghostly plume in the lantern light. It is now a thick gray mist that blends into the atmosphere, a sign of life that is barely distinguishable from the surrounding gloom. The cold has reached its zenith, a static and unchanging pressure that feels as though it has frozen time itself into a single, crystalline block. He turns to look at the lantern, which has finally consumed the last of its oil. The flame, which had been a warm, amber companion throughout the long watches of the night, gives one final, tired flicker before disappearing into a thin, spiraling thread of acrid smoke. The loss of the light is not a tragedy, but a quiet conclusion. The world is now lit by the cold, sourceless illumination of a winter dawn, a light that provides no warmth and no comfort. Within the visual style of the drawing, This transition is marked by the disappearance of the warm highlights and the introduction of a gritty, textured gray. The artist has used a series of broad, horizontal strokes to define the horizon, smudging the edges where the mountains meet the sky until the entire world feels like a single, continuous surface of textured paper. The railway is now a clear, geometric line of dark iron and gray wood, a mark of human intent that has been permanently etched into the frozen earth. The movement of packing the remaining tools onto the supply sled is a slow-motion ritual of closure. He picks up the inspection hammer, the metal of the tool now a dull, matte gray that matches the sky. It feels heavy in his hand, a weight that he has carried for an eternity. He places it into its wooden crate with a soft, muffled thud, the sound immediately swallowed by the damp, heavy air. The sledgehammer follows, its long hickory handle appearing dark and oily in the morning light. Each movement is deliberate and devoid of wasted energy. There is no joy in the completion of the shift, only a quiet, stoic acknowledgement of the labor performed. The history of the railway is not one of celebration, but of this steady, unblinking endurance. It is a boring history, a record of thousands of identical movements that have resulted in a few hundred yards of progress against the infinite. The sled is now fully loaded, a dark and heavy mass of wood and iron sitting on its icy runners. The layer takes up the tow rope, the hemp fibers stiff and abrasive against his palms. He leans into the harness, his body angling toward the ground as he seeks purchase on the slick, packed snow. The first movement of the sled is a low, grinding groan, a sound of wood against ice that vibrates through his boots and into the marrow of his bones. It is a sound that has no beginning and no end, a circular melody of friction that defines the start of his long walk back to the encampment. As he pulls the sled, his footsteps leave deep, rhythmic indentations in the snow, a series of dark hollows that are quickly filled by the fine, drifting powder carried by the wind. These footprints are like the soft, smudged marks of a pencil on a dark surface, a temporary record of his passage that the mountain will eventually erase. The visual of the track stretching back into the distance is the final, defining image of the night. The two iron rails sit perfectly parallel, their surfaces catching the dull, gray light of the morning in a way that makes them look like shimmering threads of cold. They are straight and true, a horizontal constant that cuts through the organic, chaotic shapes of the snowdrifts and the mountain ridges. The sleepers are dark, rhythmic rectangles of wood, their surfaces now coated in a fine, crystalline rime that looks like a layer of white chalk. The ballast is a textured river of dark stone, its jagged edges softened by the accumulating snow. It is a beautiful and lonely sight, a monument to the power of silent, repetitive labor. The drawing of this scene is now complete, the layers of indigo, charcoal, and gray built up until the darkness has a tangible, physical weight. As he moves away from the worksite, the layer does not look back. His focus is entirely on the immediate reality of the walk, the rhythm of his breath, and the steady, pulling weight of the sled. The cold is a constant companion, a heavy and atmospheric presence that has become a part of his very being. His fingers are numb, his joints are stiff, and his mind is a quiet, dark space where the only thoughts are of the next step and the next breath. There is no vision of the future trains, no thought of the civilization that will one day follow this iron path. There is only the iron, the snow, and the duty. He is a part of the landscape, a figure rendered in the same dark and muted tones as the mountains and the sky, his form a series of heavy, purposeful marks on the surface of the winter. The wind has picked up, a low and monochromatic moan that carries the scent of the high glaciers. It brushes against his face, a constant, abrasive presence that numbs the skin and waters the eyes. The tears freeze almost instantly, becoming tiny, crystalline pearls that cling to his eyelashes, blurring his vision into a soft, impressionistic haze. The world is reduced to the gray circle of his immediate surroundings and the rhythmic sound of the sled runners on the ice. The history of the world beyond the mountains feels like a distant and irrelevant dream. Here, the only history that matters is the history of the iron and the snow, a narrative told in the language of friction and gravity. It is a boring history, a slow and methodical recording of the passage of minutes and the accumulation of hours, but it is a history that possesses a profound and quiet dignity. The sky remains a flat and heavy gray, the clouds showing no signs of breaking. The sun is a pale, indistinct smudge of light behind the graphite curtain, providing no direction and no warmth. It is a morning that feels like a continuation of the night, a transition from one form of darkness to another. The layer continues his walk, his shadow a long, faint smudge that stretches out across the snow ahead of him. The sled moves with a steady, rhythmic grinding sound, a soundtrack to his isolation. The mountains loom on either side, their indigo peaks now appearing as shades of charcoal and slate, their presence a heavy, geological weight on the horizon. They are ancient, indifferent witnesses to his labor, their silence a reminder of the scale of the wilderness and the insignificance of human time. The railway he has built remains behind him, a permanent scar on the face of the winter. It is a work of art made of steel and stone, a human thought expressed in the language of industrial geometry. It will sit there in the cold, unmoving and indifferent, waiting for the next layer of iron and the next crew of men. It is a legacy of inches, a testament to the weight of existence in a place where the sun is only a memory. The visual style of the drawing captures this permanence with its thick, layered strokes and its deep, saturated tones. Every line of the track, every grain of the wood, and every shard of the stone is a part of the narrative, a word in a sentence that stretches across the continent. It is a story of endurance, told in the slow-motion compression of wood fibers and the steady application of force. The Layers Camp is a small huddle of tents and wooden shacks located in a sheltered hollow of the mountain, a place where the wind is slightly less aggressive. As he approaches, the camp emerges from the gray gloom as a series of dark, textured shapes, their edges softened by the drifting snow. There is no smoke rising from the chimneys yet, no sound of life from within the walls. The camp is as silent and as frozen as the mountains themselves. He brings the sled to a halt beside the supply depot, the sound of the runners stopping with a final, heavy groan. He unhooks the harness, his movements slow and creaking, his joints clicking with the cold. He stands for a moment, his hand resting on the wooden frame of the sled, his breath a steady and rhythmic cloud of vapor in the thin air. He looks back one final time toward the mountain, toward the line of the railway that disappears into the gray and indigo distance. He cannot see the individual spikes or the bolts from here, but he knows they are there, held in the cold embrace of the iron and the wood. He knows the weight of every rail and the depth of every sleeper. He has lived within the texture of the work, becoming a part of the drawing itself. The history of the iron railway is his history, a story of quiet suffering and silent endurance that he has written with his own hands. The world is at peace, a frozen tableau of labor and stillness, a dark drawing that has finally reached its conclusion. There is no more work to be done until the darkness returns, no more iron to be laid until the next watch. He moves toward his quarters, his boots making a soft, crunching sound in the snow. Each step is a repetition of the last, a loop of sound and motion that carries him toward the end of his shift. The cold remains, a heavy and atmospheric pressure that will follow him even into the relative warmth of the indoors. He enters the shack, the sound of the door closing a soft, final thud in the silence. Inside, the world is a study in shadows and low light, a space of charcoal gray and deep umber. He sits on his cot, the weight of his body pressing into the rough wool of the blankets. He does not move. He does not think. He simply breathes, the air slowly warming in his lungs, his heart beating with a slow and rhythmic thud that matches the pulse of the mountain. The story is over, the drawing is finished, and the iron remains in the snow, a straight and true line in a world of ice.